sectoral indicators and sectoral targets that could enable countries to help understand, to monitor whether they're progressing sufficiently along those 4 pillars of decarbonization. Now, I mentioned this idea that what we do now is not independent of the long-term goal, and that is really one of the key messages of our report. And I wanted to illustrate this somewhat abstract message with a case study that we did on Brazil. And what we did was to look at what are the different options to achieve a 10% reduction in emission by 2020, and looking at it as if this were the end goal. So all we want to do is to achieve a 10% reduction in 2020, versus if this is a step towards a more ambitious goal of achieving emissions of, say, 20% by 2030. So the bar, and what we found is that the country would invest in a completely different mix of measures if this is given a more ambitious goal. So the bar on the left is the mix of measures that we would use if we were to try to reduce emissions by 10% by 2020. And as you see, the darker green bar within that, or segment within that, shows that there would be a lot of investments in improvements in refinery. So it's really efficiency measures. Whereas the bar on the right shows much more investments in things like metro and public transport, things that are more complicated and more expensive, but that are necessary if we want to be able to achieve a more ambitious goal later on. So the message of this is that to get to zero emission, if we have these ambitious goal, we really need to think about how to create the potential over the coming century for these measures. And so that implies developing and testing new technologies, redirecting investments in long-lived equipment so we don't get locked into a high carbon equilibrium, and doing things like improving land use and urban development. So, and one of the things that's also extremely important is starting early. And what we know is that starting early is what enables us to do this in a cost-efficient manner. In particular, the problem, the later we start, the quicker we will have to decarbonize. And that will mean, mothballing plants that have been designed for 40 or 60-year life expectancy and shutting them down early, which is expensive, rather than taking advantage of natural opportunities to decarbonize through new investments. So what this graph shows you is that in the green lines, the green curves, shows you the link between decarbonizing, the speed at which we need to decarbonize in order to reach the 2-degree goal, versus the peaking year, which is on the horizontal axis. So for example, if we had peaked in 2010, we would have only needed to decarbonize for the rest of the century at an average speed of 3% per year. If we peak in 2015, 2016, then the rhythm at which we will have to decarbonize will be closer to 4 or 5% per year. Now, historically, we have never exceeded about 4.5% decarbonization per year, except in collapsing economy. And what you see, the horizontal green dotted line, is the maximum speed ever achieved by a country over a 5-year period for decarbonization. That was France in the height of its nuclear deployment, when it was deploying nuclear power plants across the country. And in comparison, if you look at the orange dotted line around the 1%, that is the implied average speed of emission reduction from the EU's current sets of goals. So as you can see, we're not anywhere close to peaking now, and the implication will be that we will have to be quite rapid in our decarbonization efforts. Now, it's not just all about making efforts for climate change. There are plenty of co-benefits. This is a classic example. Having public transportation is not just about reducing emissions. It's also about massively reducing congestion and the need for costly investments and more and bigger roads. And it's also about reducing local pollution, which, as you all know, is a huge concern, for example, in China. So let me switch now to the second point about, what are the policies that will be needed in order to achieve this. So let's start with carbon pricing and getting the prices right more generally. Taxing carbon is about taxing the bads and not the goods. And the main point is that regardless of what we think about its environmental policies, taxing carbon is good fiscal policies. It can generate revenues extremely efficiently. It's less distortive than if we tax jobs or investments because it does not discourage good behavior. And one of the things also that economists have found is that it's a lot easier to manage the taxation of energy sources because these come from a small number of concentrated points. So, for example, in the U.S., one study has found that it would be enough to monitor 3,000 points in the entire United States to cover 80% of the carbon tax potential. This is in contrast to the hundreds of millions of individuals and households and firms that need to be monitored in order for income or investment taxes. And as you can see from the graph, tax evasion is, as a result, much less for energy taxes or for carbon taxes than it is for corporate taxes or VAT or income taxes. This is a graph from the UK, but this kind of finding is extremely relevant for developing countries which have problems with tax evasion and a big wedge between the formal and the informal sector. And the good news is that we're seeing substantial progress on carbon pricing. Something like 39 countries and subnational jurisdiction are either implementing or have implemented carbon pricing. And I could have shown you a similar graph showing good progress also on the elimination of fossil fuel subsidies. So in 2013, fossil fuel subsidies were about $500 billion dollars per year, at least in developing countries, and at least in some 40 to 100 to 90 billion a year in OECD countries. And what we're seeing recently is a tremendous effort to get prices right and to get rid of fossil fuel subsidies. But prices are simply not enough. There are a multiplicity of market, government, coordination failures that need to be addressed. And one such set of market and coordination failures is innovation. Now, green innovation faces the same challenges than all other types of innovation. It's not simply about the green externality that could be tackled or the environmental externality that could be tackled through a carbon price. Green innovation, like others, tend to have a knowledge externality, so people tend to underinvest in it because they can't capture all its benefits. Now, in addition, the work of many researchers has shown that we're better at innovating where we've innovated before. And so firms tend to continue innovating where they've been successful before. So even today, there's still a lot more innovation that happens in older technologies or in older sectors like fossil fuels, energy, old-fashioned cars, than in the new greener fields. And so that warrants direct support from the government. In addition, we don't necessarily favor simply having a subsidy for all green technologies. It makes sense to subsidize more those technologies that have more potential. And one good example of this is wind and solar energy. So wind today tends to be cheaper than solar energy, but analysts all agree that solar is going to play a much more important role and is going to be absolutely critical in order to reach full decarbonization. It's got simply greater potential. So one of the things that makes sense is to target not just green energy in general, but certainly try to favor solar so that we can continue seeing the kind of price decreases and technological improvements that will be necessary. Another thing also is not just to ensure, because the technology challenge is a dual challenge of innovation and deployment. So one of the things we need to put in place are measures that will encourage firms to adopt these new technologies or demand innovation on the part of those people who can innovate. And one of the things we need to put in place are measures that ensure that new investments are more efficient. So the type of options that are useful for this are performance standards such as CAFE standards for cars or efficiency standards on buildings and home. And you can see there from the graph what has been achieved over the last decade or 15 years with CAFE standards, which have brought a substantial decrease in emissions associated with car and substantial increase in efficiency. Alternatively, also there can be fiscal incentives or financial incentives, such as feed-in tariffs for renewable, or fiscal incentives for people to buy more efficient cars. Now, let me insist on this point about the importance of acting on new investments. When we try to act on existing investments, then we trigger, as I will come back to later, we trigger a lot of pushback. Whereas on new investments, yes, companies may complain about it, but we're not necessarily punishing firms and individuals for making a decision that was the right decision to make 5 years ago in a different regulatory environment. Plus, by acting on new investments and getting firms to invest in these new green technologies, it makes it less interesting for them to try to convince the next government to reverse these measures, because they will already be more invested in the green economy. But another set of measures that's really important is to provide the right infrastructure so that people have choices, have the ability to respond to prices. One of the things we know is that in the United States, part of the reasons why there's so much resistance to an increase in energy prices is that most people do not live in a place that is served by public transportation. Most people don't have the choice to switch to a car, bicycle, or walking to work when prices go up. And colleagues did this case study on Paris where they looked at the influence that the public transportation system has had on the location of households and businesses. And what they found is that without the metro system, the transport needs of Paris, of the people who live in Paris or in the agglomeration, would be twice as high, and it would emit twice as much CO2 as it currently do. In addition, a carbon tax or energy taxes would be half as efficient. So urban planning and public transportation are a critical part of the overall infrastructure. Another thing we know is a number of countries who have invested heavily in renewables are now struggling because they haven't put in place the transmission lines that are needed to get the energy, the clean energy, from where it's produced to where it will be consumed. And finally, we all are rational human beings, so we tend to respond to prices, but in fact, we tend to not perfectly behave like Homo economicus. We tend to be more sensitive to things like social norms. So, for example, in a country where it might be considered appropriate to walk your dog by driving your SUV, there are things that need to be done in order to do, in addition to price incentives, in order to change people's minds. So, traditional things have been done, like energy labeling, but also resorting to peer pressure. So there's this company in the United States called O-Power that now sends energy bills, electricity bills at the house, ranking you relative to your neighbors and putting a little smiley face if you've done well and you've not overconsumed. There's also things like relying on our tendency to go with the status quo. We're typically somewhat lazy. We don't sort of go out of our way to change things. So one company in Germany and many others, I think, around the world are doing this, is to switch the customers to a higher, greener tariff, but giving them the option to switch back. And in this company in Germany, they found that something like 94% of the customers remained with the higher green tariff once it had done, and only a few percent actually chose to actively go back to the old tariff. So now let's switch to the third pillar, or the third step in these transitions, which is really about the political economy. So we know that this is at the heart of these transitions. Carbon taxes, any kind of taxes, is unpopular. So, for example, a number of jurisdictions are now referring to them as levies rather than taxes. But more generally, carbon pricing impacts, or switch to a greener world, impacts negatively the value of polluting assets. So people who've just bought a big SUV or a house in the distant suburbs that will require a lot of, and in the middle of the desert, that will require a lot of a high energy bill and a lot of transport, or firms that have invested in carbon, are going to be against this big transition. So one of the big arguments that we have is that climate policies will be successful only if they actually contribute to development more broadly and to poverty reduction in general. Governments have a multiplicity of goals. They're not simply there. It's not going to be possible for them to focus on this one single goal. But the good news is that it is perfectly possible to design climate policies so that poor people benefit. Getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies, putting in place carbon taxes generates revenues that can then be reinvested in development and poverty reduction. And in fact, what we looked at is the impact of recycling $100 from a fossil fuel subsidy to just a universal cash transfer. That doesn't even make an effort to target poor people. And what we found is that would actually greatly benefit poor people and increase the resources that are available to them. But and this is my final slide, it's not just poor people. When we talk about distributional impact, we have to realize that a major transition, a major rejigging of the economy will have winners and losers. And it's really critical to try to avoid concentrated losses and smooth the shock, because the benefits of climate change policies will be very broad and benefit a lot of different people, whereas the losses tend to be concentrated and tend to trigger a lot of resistance. So let me end here and open it up for a discussion.
Thanks, Marianne. As webinar participants will have noted, we've received a number of questions. However, before jumping into the questions we received during the webinar, we just also wanted to summarize a few of the questions we received from participants during the registration process. And we've attempted to synthesize these into four main categories. Marianne, perhaps we could start by addressing a few of these questions, maybe starting with measurement and development. The measurement question is really focused on whether current development indicators and metrics, whether you find that these are appropriate for tracking the sustainability of national development. And very much in terms of your own presentation, the transition to full decarbonization. And development, I think you've answered this question somewhat, but we received a few questions on whether decarbonizing development would be good for the poor, and whether you have any concrete examples of how decarbonization could also help alleviate poverty.
Okay, let me start. Thank you for these questions. These are good. Let me start with the measurement. I would argue that current development indicators and measures and metrics are not, in fact, typically appropriate to measure the sustainability of development. And there's been a lot of efforts in recent years to address this issue. I think many of you have probably heard about natural capital accounting and the efforts that are being made to add to the UN accounting framework measures to try to understand the sustainability of the growth process. And the argument there is that no firm would go to the market with just an income account. All firms tend to go to the market or measure their performance in terms of an asset account. And typically what we use is GDP, which is just a measure of the flow of income, not of wealth. So these efforts like wealth accounting and natural capital accounting are really to try to look at the sustainability, which requires an asset approach. Now, that's the broader sustainability story. In addition, I think and as I mentioned in my presentations, there's ways for governments and firms to develop measures. There's plenty of measures that they can put in place to monitor sustainability, at least say from a carbon point of view and from a resource use point of view. And these exist. It's just a question of adopting them. And I would like to go to the question about poverty, because that is a really important topic. We know that in the long run, tackling climate change is good for the poor, because they tend to be the most vulnerable to climate change. But it does not follow that any mitigation policies will be good for the poor. In fact, one of the big messages of our report is that it's important that we design our mitigation policies in a way that can benefit the poor. And it's perfectly possible to do this. For example, British Columbia, who's put in place a carbon tax, has used parts of the proceeds of this to help protect the poor against higher energy prices. And there's a number of lots of countries who've removed fossil fuel subsidies have used the proceeds of the fossil fuel subsidy reform to put in place safety nets or reduce school fees and things like that.
Thank you. Maybe before we now turn to the other two questions that we summarized, we have received a number of good questions from the participants of the webinar, so maybe we'll turn our attention to a few of those. For instance, from Lauren Neville-Gisnas, she asks, Marianne, are there any plans that the Paris Climate Agreement and negotiations will make decarbonization more realistic? And perhaps linked to that, we received a question from Snezana Marstijepovic. What are your views on the determination of CO2 budgets for developing and least developed countries and setting of their CO2 reduction targets by 2050 to 2100, in the context of identifying responsibility and accountability for historic CO2 emissions?
Okay, you became a little fuzzy there, but I think I can read the second question. So let me start with the first one about the plans for Paris and whether Paris is going to be important in helping us achieve the full decarbonization. So I think if we can get a good accord in Paris, what it will be is to make it much more clear that there's going to be a substantial change in the future, and that helps firms, that helps other countries understand that there is a clear direction, and it makes it a lot easier to invest in the right thing. But I think what Paris is going to be about is really about this road forward. I don't think anybody expects a final perfect agreement on zero carbon. But if at least it can put us in the right direction, I think it could be extremely helpful. One of the things we should not underestimate is the extent to which there's a massive culture change that is happening and will need to continue happening in all our societies about the realization of the need for decarbonization. And I think Paris can really help towards that way. But I don't think anybody is approaching Paris like they were approaching Copenhagen 4 or 5 years ago, when, people approached Copenhagen in a fairly naive black and white way. Either we got a perfect agreement or we got nothing. Lots of countries have shown that they're willing to move forward, even individually. Look at what China has promised, and I think most of us believe that China will deliver much more than it has promised. So while Paris is important, I think individual countries are now willing to lead by example rather than wait for collective action. Now, let me try to understand Snezana's question. I'm just reading it on the screen. What are your views on the determination of CO2 budgets for developing and LDCs and setting of their CO2, in the context of the responsibility and accountability for historic CO2 emissions? So that really links to my earlier response. I think we need to move past this idea of, rich countries like France and Germany and the US grew dirty and now they want everybody else to not follow their path and do something better. Well, yeah, but when the Industrial Revolution took place, there was 1.5 billion people on this planet, and now we're on our way to 9 billion. So clearly the options are not the same. At the same time, the technologies that are available are not the same. So, if you see people doing something wrong, does that mean you should do it? No, of course not. You can do better. I think we're smarter today than we were. So I think clearly developing countries are part of the solution. They're now, more than 50% of global emissions. So it's not going to be possible to solve climate change without substantial efforts on the part of developing countries. But what is important also is that high-income countries take on their responsibilities in terms of supporting this effort, and that can take two forms. One is providing resources, but I think more importantly is that it is the role and responsibility of high-income countries to develop the technologies, and most importantly, to enable these technologies to reach high scales so that the prices become affordable for developing countries.
Thanks. We also have a very interesting question, Marianne, from Thomas Flockel. I don't know if you see it on your screen, but he asks about feed-in tariffs and whether now, if they're truly desirable for renewables, given that we see very competitive PV and wind costs, often below what was expected, and then potentially below where feed-in tariffs would be set, and whether then feed-in tariffs might act as a barrier to the integration of renewables.
I think feed-in tariffs are one. This is a good question, Thomas, by the way. I think we have to understand feed-in tariffs as one of the many instruments that can be used in order to get to this level of to the scale where we can get the prices to go down. I mean, if you look at what Germany managed to achieve with its feed-in tariff, it is largely responsible for the massive decrease in the price of solar panel around the world, making it possible for others to now maybe do away with feed-in tariffs. So where we have a problem is when there aren't good ways of adjusting the feed-in tariffs along with the cost improvements. So I don't think there's a problem with the instrument. I think it's an instrument that needs to be used intelligently and adapted to what we see in the cost declines.
Thanks. I think this is probably close to your heart, Marianne. The one question from Zara Fang was, has there been any studies about whether taxing bads can provide enough income to replacing taxing goods, which I think alludes to one of your recommendations in terms of a carbon tax?
That's a good question. I don't know whether somebody has really looked at whether we could fully replace if we could rely only on taxing bads. That's a very good question, and I'm going to go and Google that and try to look at some of the literature we've reviewed. But certainly, there's an interesting, what you bring to mind here is a question or a debate that exists within the economic community where a number of people say, look, carbon is not a good tax base because fundamentally what you want to see is zero carbon. We want to get to zero carbon. So you're looking at a tax base that erodes over time. And that is true in the long run by 2100, but certainly over the next 50 years or so, what we want to see is a gradual increase in carbon prices at the same time as that tax base erodes. So there's certainly enough there to be able to generate substantial fiscal resources. Though, to be fair, no countries in the world today has, even countries like Sweden and British Columbia, or jurisdiction like British Columbia, none of them derive more than a few percentage of their taxes from carbon. However, most countries have relied substantially on energy taxes, particularly fuel taxes. So that is a tax base that's well understood, that pretty much every country in the world relies upon. But as to whether we could completely go from taxing the goods to taxing the bads, I'm not sure. But certainly I think we've got a long way to go before we exhaust the potential.
Yeah, and just to note that Zara had a follow-up question related to this, and just indicating that it at least from their perspective, taxing bads seems like it might be regressive, whereas income tax is progressive. And what could be done to mitigate the regressiveness of this of taxing bads?
So we have a long discussion of this particular issue in the report that you can look at if you want. But so in high-income countries, we know that the poor tend to spend a higher share of their budget on energy sources. So there it becomes very important to compensate the increase in energy prices caused by either energy tax or carbon tax with various kinds of subsidies. Typically, we would be in favor of broad income support rather than something necessarily targeted to energy. But in a number of countries, what they've done is to maintain a subsidized first block or a low-cost first block. Because poor households don't typically consume a lot of energy, so subsidizing the first the small consumption. Now, in developing countries, the story is a little bit different because what we find is that the poor often don't have access to modern energy sources. So it's more likely than not, the direct sort of consumption impact is in fact equitable, though it can be harmful to the poor. And in some cases, one of the things we worry about is that with higher energy prices, more poor people will continue with traditional energy, like solid biomass, like wood and things like that, which pollutes more and is harmful also in terms of indoor pollution. So there again, there are various schemes that have been put in place to try to offset the cost of higher energy. Now, to go back to the high-income countries, what overall analysis does show that typically, though, when there's an increase in energy prices, poor people tend to receive more money from the government through social transfers, and these tend to be well indexed to inflation. So in the end, the net effect that was found, say, in British Columbia and in various other places, was in fact in favor of the poor.
Thanks. So we're receiving quite a few questions now, Marianne. So I think your comments have triggered additional questions. One from Yuvadia Veldkamp, with the Vancouver Economic Commission, asks, what else can local government economic development agencies do? And then perhaps related to this somewhat, from Henry Newbell, he asks, which could be the most promising sectors in developing countries for leapfrogging policies towards development with decarbonization?
These are good questions. I think in terms of local economic development, I think certainly I think there's two types of things. One is just making the city, the particular city, greener through, and typically the interesting things in cities is that what's needed for adaptation, what's needed for mitigation is also typically what's needed for adaptation and for improved livability. So be it public transportation, green roofs, parks as flood, for both flood absorption and reduced emission and carbon storage or carbon sinks. These tend to be win-wins no matter what. So I think selling your city as a green destination or as a green city seems to have become increasingly popular. And I could, if you want to follow up with me, I can certainly, and although if you're with the Vancouver Economic Commission, I'm sure that you're involved with all the city networks that have been doing a tremendous amount of work on these issues in recent years. So that's one thing. But the second is this question of whether the city can directly try to attract green industries or make the city a place that favors green industries. And this is a topic I know less about, but I think, working in places that have universities or in places that have particular existing industries, then it might be possible to work with these existing industries to see whether there is a green angle to it. As to promising sectors in developing countries for leapfrogging, I think, again, it would be the urban sector. But infrastructure more generally, I think a lot of developing countries are still in the process of building their infrastructure stock. And it's possible, you know, and if you think about phones, for example, very few developing countries are ever going to develop the kind of fixed line systems that we have in the US or in Europe or in Canada, because there's no need for it. It's simply not what is needed. And instead, they've switched directly to cell phone for the most part. And I think we're seeing this with, you know, the new energy systems that will be developed. It is now possible to in many cases, it makes no sense to be on the grid, at least in the short to medium run, for at least remote rural areas. So I think the infrastructure sectors is very much where the leapfrogging can occur.
Thank you. We have an interesting question from Benai Ado. He asks, to what extent you've done research on decarbonization in Africa, and you know, and whether that research cuts across developing countries.
Yes, I mean it depends what exactly you mean by decarbonization in Africa. I mean, there's certainly lots of most African countries, with the exception certainly of South Africa, tend to be low carbon emitters. But the carbon intensity of some of the countries can be actually fairly high. So there's several strands of work that are ongoing in the discussions with African countries. One is, you know, to what extent Africa can take advantage of the LULUCF, how do you call it, the land use-based carbon mitigation. So that these tend to be the countries with the large forests, the DRC and countries like that. Another is Africa, as you know, still has very limited access to electricity. I think we're at about 30% of households across the sub-Saharan Africa that have access to electricity. But it is a region that is only tapping about 10% of its hydro potential. So, you know, this is certainly an area where developing the hydro would, again, be win-win, help provide energy as well as put Africa on a clean path.
Thanks. And we have a question from Serini Witana, and it links back to the question we received earlier as well on financing. How can the financing needs for research and development, infrastructure, et cetera, be met? And what is the role of private versus public sources? And how can the private financing be further leveraged? And this links to one of the questions we received before the webinar in terms of closing the existing financing gap. Much of your report focuses on financing, but what do you see is needed in the short run versus medium term and long term?
Okay, thanks. I did not in the presentation talk a lot about the financing challenge, but we do have a chapter on this issue in the report. And our argument is that the challenge is twofold. One is we've got to grow the pie of financing, and second, we have to green the pie, the financing pie, or increase the share of the financing that goes to green investment. I mean, before we can even really, one of the issues is we tend to see the green finance discussions really focused on the green side, when in developing countries very often, or not just in developing countries in fact, often cities, for example, are not going to do the right investment simply because they can't access the kind of financing that they need. And with renewables, for example, we go from a model or an investment model where the upfront cost is not so large, but the operating costs are very high, to the renewable approach, which has the renewable investment pattern, which is an extremely high upfront investment and then basically zero operating costs. So clearly the financing will increase. So now some of it then has to do with developing countries themselves becoming more attractive to investors. And there isn't a shortage of financing around the world. There are billions that are looking for good investments. What we do see and what we do know, and we've known this for a very long time, is that there is a shortage of good investment opportunities, of bankable projects. So that is really the responsibility of countries and institutions like the World Bank can help, is to develop a pipeline of projects that can be attractive to the private sector. And that requires, having good laws in place and a good investment framework and so on and so forth. Now, in terms of then increasing the share of this investment, these investment flows that go to green, we believe that, yes, it's great to have things like green bonds, but we think that it's really important to actually use the banking sector and monetary policy to make it attractive to invest green. And I don't know if any of you are aware of the UNEP inquiry into, what is it called? An inquiry into the design of a sustainable financial system. And I really encourage you to Google it. They've already issued 4 short little reports. And the argument, and also they've been working with the Central Bank of China, who issued what I think is absolutely a historical landmark report a few weeks ago, that argues that we need to use financial and monetary policy, that ratio, bank ratio, reserve ratios should be different for green investment, for non-green investment. They argue in favor of things like firms having to disclose their environmental vulnerabilities. You've had the director of the Central Bank of England, who's on the record for asking companies to disclose their carbon, their potential stranded assets in case we put in place a carbon price. So I think we're moving from a narrow focus on things like green bonds and things like that to this idea of how do we deploy our monetary policies and our banking policies in order to be able to foster much greener investments.
Thanks. So, Marianne, we have about 8 minutes left. There are 2 other questions that have been posed. One is really around the sectors, the economic sectors that the report identified as the transport, building, and industry sectors. And those were presumably highlighted because they were ripe for gains in terms of energy efficiency and switching to renewable energy sources. One of the questions that I posed prior to the webinar is, do you have examples of how these sectors are moving towards decarbonization? I know you in your presentation did give some examples. I was wondering if you could just expand on that a bit. And then I think a more selfish question from the Green Growth Knowledge Platform perspective in terms of knowledge gaps. Where through the development of this report, where do you see the most urgent? What do you see as the most urgent knowledge needs, and where are the most pertinent gaps in knowledge between what governments know and what knowledge is needed to put in place the right policies?
Okay, so in terms of building an industry, I think yes, there's a number of examples. What's interesting in these 2 sectors is that there's been tremendous innovation in the last 10 or 15 years. I mean, in the building sector, we know that it's now possible to cost effectively build zero emission, completely carbon neutral, energy neutral buildings. A number of countries are now developing standards, construction standards and enforcing them. In France, for example, now there's an obligation when you sell an existing building to bring it up to code, up to a point. So one of the things, the thing that's difficult in the building sector, though, is that it's not possible to transform that sector overnight, and that would be tremendously costly. So one of the things that's very important is to do things like what France has done, which is to gradually sort of put in place systems so that that we don't just build new buildings that are energy efficient and so on and so forth, but we address the existing park. One of the big challenges for developing countries is that most developing countries have building codes, but in many countries they're not enforced, and we've seen that with problems during earthquakes and things like that. So a question is, how do you make the adopting these technologies attractive to builders or to households that have very limited resources and often don't necessarily employ a contractor or somebody with a competence. And so that's one of the things that we really need to look into. And that ties to your question about implementation challenge and knowledge gaps. I think in terms of the knowledge gaps, there's two broad categories, right? One is, what are some of the big questions that we're still investigating about, what's going to be the impact of climate change? How do we factor in, how do we build right in situations of deep uncertainty, which is work my team and I have been working on, but lots of people are struggling with. We were working doing some work in Morocco, and in Rabat they did this big study to see what they should adapt to in the future, and the models are in some cases saying that there'll be 30% more rain, and in other cases that there'll be 30% less rain. So figuring out how to adapt to all these new climates, as well as to the uncertainty about policies, I think is one of the big challenges. And then the other, I think, is really the implementation challenge of how do you do better, and all these things we've been talking about doing better, such as building codes, but do this in situations where there is limited resources, be they financial, institutional. How do we put all these things in place? So I think what's important is to understand that we are trying to get on the right track. We probably won't get every step of the way correct, but at least to try to move in the right direction.
Thank you. So Marianne, before we close, do you have any final remarks from your side? Questions you would have wished had been posed but weren't, or anything else you would like to add?
No, I think that the question I really wanted to have a discussion about is this issue of, is this going to be bad for the poor? Or is this something that can be made compatible with the objectives of development? And I think we discussed that. And I think the key message is mitigation policies can be made to be good for the poor, but that requires real attention to how they're designed. And it's not going to happen automatically, but it can very well be done, and it's not rocket science.
Thank you, Marianne, for this superb presentation. I would also like to congratulate you and the World Bank on the publication of the Decarbonizing Development report. That is, as we have seen from your presentation, provides concrete and pragmatic steps for achieving green growth and decarbonization. I just have two final notes for participants. You will be receiving an email survey after the webinar, and we would definitely appreciate your feedback so that we can improve on how we organize and conduct future webinars. Finally, this webinar has been recorded, and we will be uploading the recording to the GGKP web platform in the next few days, so please check the GGKP website. And with that, I would like to once again thank you, Marianne, for your time, fascinating presentation, and all of the participants as well for their active engagement and questions. Thank you, and we look forward to welcoming you to our next webinar.
And thank you to all the participants, and thank you to GGKP.
Thank you.